Where are you right now?
Iowa State University in my office.
You did not grow up in Iowa. You grew up in Central Oregon. So how did you end up where you currently are right now?
Oh, a variety of things brought me here. Uh, One of them, my wife, and that, the sign of a healthy marriage is is compromise, and my compromise is always doing what my wife tells me to do. So we moved to the Midwest to be closer to her family. They live in Wisconsin. They run a dairy farm there. So when this job opened up, with only a 4-hour window between here, Ames, Iowa, and there, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, it seemed like a great fit. It also seemed like a great fit because it's a graduate program that not only emphasizes creative writing, but also the environment. And uh, I have strong feelings about students having a foundation of knowledge outside of craft uh, when they're studying writing, when they're trying to punch out a book. And my work is obviously very place-based and has an environmental sensibility that's not necessarily green, but that employs the location and the history and culture, as well as the geography of a place, and manifests it as a kind of character. And in so many ways, this was a great fit, except for, of course, the landscape of Iowa, which is anything but inspiring to a Westerner like me.
I do want to talk to you about the very different landscape. I had mentioned before that you grew up in Central Oregon, and where I first came across your work, as I'm sure for many people, was in Best American Short Stories with your short story Refresh, Refresh. And certainly there, the environment and the place plays a big part, most notably the giant impact crater that your characters hang out at. What I got from that story is almost a sense of place. I mean, a big wound, whether it's, the wounds in these guys' faces as they're beating each other up, or the big open space in the ground, that there's a lot missing there. And talk to me a little bit about negative space in your work.
Well, the landscape is infused with emotion, the way I write it. So here you have these kids who, they're at the ragged edges of life. And since we're filtered through their point of view, you've got this high desert landscape described in such a way that it's very threatening. It's infused with violence. You have, the Cascade Mountains looming over them like a jawline. You have peregrine falcons swooping down and seizing chipmunks to carry away, to eviscerate. And you have craters like Hole in the Ground, a place where they go to do some daredevil sledding, a place that also becomes, the stage for the climax of the story when bad things happen. So, I'm always trying to keep in mind that a stage is not generic, but is instead directly related to the mood of a moment, and can become too an overlying metaphor, as well as an active participant in a scene, so that the way that the sun sets, or the way that a tree bends against the wind, can be important as any gesture given by a character, or any snippet of dialogue. Well, I always have these echoes in my stories, these rhymes. So, Hole in the Ground is one of those. You've got, for starters, the opening image of these kids in the backyard after school with this hose made into a ring, and they're beating the snot out of each other. And over time, as you return to that backyard scene, the ground begins, to grow excavated by their hurried footsteps. And it becomes kind of a crater in itself, a shallow depression that takes on, the color of dried blood. And then you've got that mimicking Hole in the Ground, this crater, which in itself mimics an impact crater from a mortar round. And so if this story is all about the battleground at home, and also about the absence of these fathers, then that carved out space really epitomizes that.
In reading your work, I'm left with kind of what I feel when I finish reading some Hemingway stuff, which is this guy who wrote it, he's a tough guy. Do you consider yourself a tough guy, and do you set out to write quote unquote tough literature?
I just write what comes out of the ether. I never have any sort of strategy when it comes to, theme or content. I'm not sitting down and saying, I'm going to write about that old father and son thing, as Russell Banks calls it. I'm usually begin with an image and go from there. And maybe I have three or four images in mind, and they begin to align themselves like a constellation as I move progressively through these drafts. So I'm not sure what more I can say on the subject, except that, I grew up in the middle of nowhere. I grew up surrounded by ranchers and loggers. I've got deep roots in Oregon. My great grandparents laid the roads in Eastern Oregon. My grandfather, built the mill that was at the center of Bend before this yuppie revolution occurred there. Uh, and I'm just sort of channeling experience here. So I don't want to say, I'm a tough guy. Even, all I can say is that, I grew up in a hunting family. I grew up sleeping on the ground most nights in the summer. And when I open up that trapdoor in my mind that goes into the imagination, the first place that rises up for me is, the playground of my childhood, which was a rather rough and tumble, Huck Finish kind of place.
Are you glad in terms of being able to use those experiences to help you as a writer? Are you glad that you grew up in that kind of a setting?
Oh yeah, um, but not just for aesthetic reasons. I mean, I'm glad I grew up there for cultural reasons as well. I mean, I look around at the way we live now, and it's everything is safety belted, everything is fenced in. Kids aren't allowed to roam more than a few paces from their parents without somebody saying a sharp word. Everybody's got a helmet and elbow pads and knee pads on. And I grew up on 37 acres of land, and I'd leave in the morning and I wouldn't come back un- until evening sometimes. And sometimes that was a bad thing. I got into quite a bit of trouble, but I just, I made my own fun, and you know, learned how to ignore a wound, and learned how to fire a slingshot at a jackrabbit, and learned how to duck under a barbed wire fence and all of that, all those things that you know I'm harvesting right now in my imagination, and that seem to be virtually unavailable to kids these days. And I just wonder what kind of impact that's going to have on sort of their adult sensibility. If somebody's always there to throw a pillow under their ass when they fall, or smear Neosporin across a boo-boo, or micromanage every minute of their day, seems to me, that's not the kind of life I would have wanted.
Are politics a part of your stories? And in particular, I'm thinking about, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are politics a part of the stories, or are they just another kind of side story character, if you will?
Well, with Refresh, I set off with the express purpose of writing about the war. This is 2005, and nobody at that point, to my knowledge, had really written about Iraq. Many stories have come out since then, obviously. But at that moment, I had read so many articles and I'd seen so many programs, but no fiction. So set off to try to tackle it in some capacity. But when I did that, I've always been really hesitant about partisan fiction.
Mhm.
And I know some people get really up in arms about this, but I just feel like I don't want to be fed a message. Like I don't want to feel like I'm reading an editorial, or else the fiction feels false. It feels like a vehicle for that. So, I wanted to write a story that didn't say war is good or war is bad, but instead said this is war. That tried to show both sides. I mean, the kids in Refresh, they feel immense pride for their fathers, but at the same time, they hate the war. Uh, it's a mixed up equation, and I like writing in gray shades about anything. You know, so when I write about political issues, I try to be political without being polemical, but that's not always possible. It's what I'm trying to do.
You write short stories, you're a novelist, you also write nonfiction. I read you regularly in Poets and Writers. Do you approach things differently when you're writing a short story or novel versus an article for a nonfiction publication?
It's all prose. I'm using a lot of the same tricks when it comes to characterization or metaphor, or the way that the style of my sentence might match the content, the way setting might rise up. But nonfiction is, of course, a different animal when it comes to relaying messages, especially. As you write nonfiction, you're typically, not always, but typically presenting your point a little bit more obviously, saying, even if your thesis is delayed, like, this is what this experience means. This is what you should take away from it. Whereas fiction, you know, allows a kind of co-authorship in inviting the reader in to make sense of the circumstances. So there's that. Uh, there's obviously some code shifting that goes on when I'm writing craft articles in particular for poets and writers, but even in those pieces, I rely a lot on storytelling to sort of get my points across. Uh, so I'm always trying to thrill the reader. Uh, Whether I'm writing about ways to triangulate dialogue in an article, or whether I'm trying to create an imaginary world that the audience fully believes in my fiction. So Barry Hannah once said to me, when I was asking him what a writer should try to do when hammering out a solid short story, he said, "Thrill me." And I always keep that in mind.